An infrastructure deal reportedly within reach. Lawmakers say they're getting close to finalizing the roughly $1 trillion package, but they're still working on some key issues like how much money to direct to public transit and broadband and how Democrats plan to pay for it. Joining me now, Tennessee Congressman, Financial Services Committee member David Kustoff. Congressman, you're arguing Americans don't want another spending plan. We already spent about $6 trillion, including the $1.9 trillion from earlier this year.
You're spot on. And that's why President Biden, in my opinion, when he was sworn into office, instead of pushing that $1.9 trillion spending plan, should have started with infrastructure, because infrastructure normally is bipartisan. It should be bipartisan. And we'll see what happens with the Senate in terms of their structuring the bill. But obviously, Dagen, a big part of it is, how do you define infrastructure? How do they define infrastructure, and how do they expand it? I think about roads, bridges, waterways. I include rural broadband in that, railways. If they start expanding that definition, talking about electric vehicles and charging stations and Green New Deal and climate, then I think for a lot of people on my side of the aisle that it becomes a bust.
Steve Forbes, jump in here. The Wall Street Journal editorial page writes this, that there's $1 trillion so far that's been allocated by the federal government in relief that isn't even spent yet. There's about $500 billion that was showered on states and cities between March 2020 and March 2021. And I think roughly $210 billion of that, Steve Forbes, hasn't been spent either. It's just astonishing, the money sloshing around.
Yes, and there's going to be more of it. And I think that just goes to show the inflation dangers ahead. But also in terms of the infrastructure bill, we have Republicans supposedly negotiating a bipartisan agreement. Usually hold on to your wallets when you hear those words. And I'm wondering about the congressman, is there going to be a real push for the Republicans to get real concessions from the Democrats? For example, it takes 10 years to do a project like a bridge that used to take 2 years. You have crazy rules on wages and things like that. Are the Republicans going to make any changes there? They're just going to go along for the ride, so to speak.
Well, Steve, I can't talk about the Senate side, but I think on the side where I am in the House of Representatives, those are absolutely the points that we're going to concentrate on. We need to get the bureaucracy out of it, if that's making a number of assumptions, assuming that we in fact do get a bill. And then something that Dagen and Steve, you all just talked about is that money that's already been approved by Congress that hasn't been spent. Is there a way to, in this bill, and they're working on this, to claw back some of that money or repurpose some of that money that hasn't gone out the door yet? It amazes me here in Washington that we can talk about a project and somebody, and I think I'm using the word arbitrarily because I think it's right, assigns a price tag. Well, this is going to cost $300 billion, or this is going to cost $563 billion. Well, how do we know that? And the point that editorial made, I think, is exactly right, that figures were set aside for cities and states and whatnot, and yet that money hasn't gone out the door.
I want to move on to this. Texas Governor Greg Abbott now ordering the Texas National Guard to assist with arrests at the U.S.-Mexico border. Congressman, your reaction to that and what you're seeing at the border?
So I went to the border within the last 60 days, my second trip to the border. And, to put it in perspective, we can throw a lot of numbers out there, but the most recent data that I've seen, in June of 2020, last year, there were around 35,000 encounters at the southwest border. Last month, June of this year, there were almost 190,000 encounters, which tells you, to Governor Abbott's point, that our folks at the border, at the southern border, they're overwhelmed and they're outmanned. So I do think they need that support. And I tell you, this is just basic stuff. We've got to finish the wall. I mean, when I went to the border, and you literally see where the wall stops. You don't have to worry about climbing over the wall or getting over the wall. So now you just walk around to the left side or the right side where it ends. So I think three things. One is making sure that there are enough people down there to protect the border. Two, finishing the wall. And three, and this is an important point because the Biden administration is talking about getting rid of something called Title 42,
right,
which gives those border control folks the authority to turn people away for health reasons. With all the COVID variants that are coming through, with the numbers that we're seeing, they cannot get rid of Title 42. The Biden administration has to keep that in place, or we're going to be overrun at the border.
Congressman, thank you for that, and thank you for being here this morning. Always.
Thank you so much.
David Kustoff.